this is rather fun. Okay, I'm B. Ruby Rich. I'm here as interlocutor with the legend. And we've decided to start back sort of at the beginning, back at the origin moment. That is the moment of the women's film festivals and that original work that shaped so much of what came after, at least in the near term. And we first met in Chicago in 1973. And after hearing this whole litany, I have to say, I had the great freedom of meeting you before you'd written a word about film.
Or anything, indeed.
Or most anything, a few art essays. But we were there in Chicago working together on a women's film festival inspired by the one at Edinburgh. And we decided we'd start with this moment because it shaped so much that came after it. It cast a very long shadow. And film festivals in those days, I think, were very different than they are now, precisely because you couldn't see anything without going there. In fact, even the people that programmed festivals sometimes couldn't see what they were showing till the prints arrived, going on reputation. And we wanted to start with Edinburgh, and I want to know if you want to say a few things about that, Laura, before we go any further.
Yes, and I'd like to say how wonderful it is to have our old friend Linda Miles, who started it all here. And I think one of the ways in which times changed under the influence of the women's liberation movement, this was almost before feminism consisted as a current, immediate idea. One of the key points of excitement was finding lost works, work by women that had been forgotten and which could now be excavated and seen again in a different context and with different eyes. And when Linda agreed that Edinburgh Film Festival would run what I think we call the Women in Film event. Mm-hmm. It was the first event of its kind. In actual fact, there was one in New York that came just before us. And in those days, of course, of intense solidarity, we weren't indignant. We just shared information. But it was a very innovative and exciting moment. And just as Ruby said, you couldn't necessarily look at everything in advance. There was a lot of intuition and a certain amount of reading into the past what we wanted to find in the present. So I think it was what I think of as excavation,
archaeology, really.
Yes.
I started out to be an archaeologist.
You
so
didn't?
Yes, yeah, in college.
I never knew that.
Yes, Mesoamerican archaeology.
Really?
Yeah, but this
And
felt
then
like the
moved
same
on to film
practice.
festivals.
Yeah, it seemed the same practice, really.
Yes. Yeah. But and I think you put it so beautifully in your book, Chick Flicks, where you introduce the festival atmosphere, that it was one of extraordinary excitement and enthusiasm. And for me, 72 was an originating moment. It was the first kind of feminist cultural action that I'd been involved with.
Well, it was kind of the cultural extension of the political work that had preceded it and built on a lot of those same networks and acquaintances and people around the world exchanging information and really trying to make a change in how people saw cinema, because no one believed there'd been these films by women. That's the other thing. It was trying to find what there was out there and prove that women had been doing work that we just didn't know about.
Exactly. Yes, not very much. But I think you put that very well, because it was a moment in which ideas were traveling, ideas were on the move, but ideas don't just move themselves. They need facilitators. They need people like Linda at Edinburgh, they also need the new films to come in and to be shown. So there was a sense in that early 70s period that the cinema was changing across the world. And small distribution companies like the Other Cinema brought in late 60s Godard, Straub Huillet, Glauber Rocha, Chantal Ackermann. And these films wouldn't have reached us if there hadn't been the commitment to make these things happen. Also, I'll never forget sitting here in NFT 1 in 1973 when David Curtis and Simon Field put on a season of international experimental film where I saw for the first time Yvonne Rainer, again Chantal Ackermann, Joyce Wieland, who allowed me to visualize a new cinema made by women within a consciousness of women's liberation. So I just think it's important to remember that not only do ideas move, but people have to move them. So in a sense, out of the new horizons of possibility that were opening up at the time was the possibility of making experimental, avant-garde, challenging, alternative, whatever you want to call it, movies. So shall we say a little bit about that, or should we just go straight into the play?
Whatever.
Yeah.
I think we can talk about it as your response to that decade, because you make Amy at the end of that decade.
Yes.
And I think that would be interesting just to hear a couple of words before we see the clip, and then we can talk about it.
Yes, and I think that for me, I'm not quite sure if this is so much the case for Peter as it is for me, but I was someone who has always responded to chance and opportunity. I've kind of taken up responded to what was going at the time. And the possibilities that opened up here in the UK were around a movement of experimental filmmakers who kind of combined together, worked together, talked together, and finally organized into the Independent Filmmakers Association. So there was a sense of solidarity across radical film, whether it was socialist collectives, whether it was artists from the London Filmmakers Co-op. And this was a short period in which 16mm film expanded our ideas of cinema from representing the world to actually expanding our understanding of the world, or something like that. Yeah.
Good.
So Peter and I, having started in Chicago with Pencils Leia, came back here, did Riddles of the Sphinx, which was probably our most important theoretical film. Peter and I, both individually, having been writing about film theoretically, now found we could make theoretical films. And Peter particularly was very keen on the idea, this idea. He used to say, people make art films, they make poetry films. Why can't we make theory films? And as that was what we were both interested in, and the opportunity was there, we did. So Amy was the third of our theory films, and it was inspired by a short piece in a newspaper that we saw in 1980 about the pioneer aviator Amy Johnson, who flew from here to Australia in 1930. And the concept behind it was a phrase taken from Brecht, happy the country that needs no heroes. And we were thinking, happy the movement that needs no heroines. And we were reflecting on the way in which Amy's move into a status of heroism then contributed to her becoming a celebrity and once again a woman of spectacle.
Let's see the clip now.
Ruby said I could make a couple of comments afterwards. I'd made a couple of comments before, so I didn't want to take up too much time. But the idea of using the polystyrene music in 1980 was that it would mark that moment of time as clearly as using the tea dance song Amy, Wonderful Amy, that came out in 1930, marked that. And so it would become, in that sense, a historical object, or it should have.
And would become iconic, in fact. But alongside trying to make these films that would be a departure from what was there and provide models for what could be, you were also beginning to critique the films made by men with women in them.
Yes.
And even by someone as beloved as Max O'Fools.
No.
And
no. I have to explain that.
yes, go ahead.
Well, I think that you're absolutely right to bring up the question of critiquing patriarchal cinema, and in a way, alongside the excavation project, alongside the New Women's Cinema project, was the critique of dominant patriarchal culture and dominant patriarchal cinema, and that was my visual pleasure and narrative cinema.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because I mentioned to Laura this morning that after we'd done all of this planning today to take you through her life, we had neglected to mention this certain essay. And I said I didn't think we could get away with not mentioning it on stage, and that people might want to hear something about how it came to be and what you think of it now and how it's been used and misused. So I won't make you give us a lecture on it, but what would you like to say about that essay now that is just been credited on screen by Changing Film Studies, changed your life in the sense of bringing you forward with it and with those ideas? And how do you feel about it now, sitting up here on stage?
Thanks a lot, Ruby.
I did warn you.
Yeah. It's, I mean, what's important to me about the essay now is that it still stands outside the standard academic essay. It was written as a polemic, and as my dear friend Mandy Merck put it, as a manifesto of its kind. And that meant that it had certain stylistic characteristics, and one that I was very criticized for at the time, possibly by my dear friend Ruby Rich and possibly others, was that throughout the whole essay, I used the third person singular masculine person. So the spectator throughout was he. Now, of course, these were the days in which the he was the universal reference to the person, the human being, the subject in society. And I wanted, in a sense, to try and shock the reader into thinking about this. But because I gave no explanation and no rationale for it, it did shock people into criticizing me very fervently. My feminist friends thought this was outrageous. But it was also important in that it was designed to make people think. And so when it said, analyzing an object of beauty destroys it, that's the object of this essay, it had these rhetorical flourishes, and the he was one of them. The other thing, of course, that was criticized was the use of Freud. Of course, Freud is now completely unfashionable once again. But in those days, with the feminist reading group that I belonged to, we were reading Freud, and we were finding that although he had very little to say about the female psyche and about the female unconscious, he had a lot to say about the patriarchal unconscious and its anxieties, its vulnerabilities, its fetishisms, its castration complexes. And we found that in analyzing the dominant cultures of patriarchy, this could be like a little kind of opening of a crack in the door that just helped us with the words of perhaps a thinker with blind spots, but also a thinker who was interested in the kinds of things we were, which was how were the genders structured, how was sexuality emerged out of the society in which dominated by patriarchy, etc., etc.
Good, good. I think that's a perfect entrance into talking about Signora dei Tutti, actually, given the clip that they're going to see.
Yes, and now can I explain about Max Ophuls?
Go ahead, please.
Max Ophuls, my essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, was really about Hollywood, about the Hollywood cinemas that I loved and that I'd started to watch with different eyes in the 1970s. But I knew the films very well, and that allowed me to write about them with a certain kind of knowledge and insight, I hope. I never really saw Max Ophuls as belonging to Hollywood, although he worked there as an exile. And I always saw him as someone who was more analytic about the condition of woman as spectacle and commodity. I might now say that retrospectively, I also think Hitchcock was quite aware of what he was doing. But then there's another reason for using this clip, which was that I had hoped to show a Max Ophuls film in my big screen classics program in December, and we hadn't managed to get one in.
But we're going to show you a clip from Signora dei Tutti, which was the last film he made, I think, before it had to do with Hollywood.
He'd recently had to escape from Berlin.
Well, yeah, that's when Hollywood got very lucky, because all of the filmmakers escaping from Berlin
He went
came
to
there.
France.
Yes.
But he made one film in Italy, which was La Signora di Tutti.
Yes.
Interestingly, as an exiled Jew, working quite easily in fascist Italy. And this is a film which is very much about the film industry and the commodification of the star. And now I think we can watch it.
Very good. Clip, please.
I wish I could show you much more, but it's a wonderful film that does exist on DVD, so I recommend
But it's fantastic to have this scene of the two men arguing over the woman's voice, the woman's body and the woman's voice, and just with her absent, and deciding her fate. It's really a fabulous, fabulous scene.
And also, Ruby, just that it then goes into the pubblicità, you know, the repeated image that comes out of the printing machine.
And those wonderful scenes that we know from the classic films, in the press room, in the newsrooms, all the apparatus that we don't have anymore.
Yes.
That's so redolent.
So I cheated rather. I didn't show one of the kind of archetypal scenes of male gaze, which we could have done, but I thought this was a slightly, perhaps more alternative, interesting take on it, as Ruby.
Well, this is a very pleasurable cheat. Thank you for that. But we're going through Laura's. This is your life, Laura. So we're going through the life, and we're coming up on the 80s. And the 80s, of course, on both sides of the Atlantic, are this decade of Reagan and Thatcherism, but also the decade of the start of Channel 4, the workshop declaration, the start of the filmmaking workshops and collectives. We're going to show a film. We're going to show Crystal Gazing in a moment. But, oh no, we're going to show Imitation of Life actually in a moment. But it's also the time of the miners' strike. It's a time of huge political changes and of the Greater London Council and then the dissolution of it. And so what about you in the 80s?
Which clip are we showing next?
We're going to show Imitation of Life because you wanted to talk about that. That's going to be next.
Okay, so
I've leapt into the 80s, but in fact, you're going to talk about Imitation of Life. These are not perfect matches, but you'll see they'll end up making sense.
Yeah. I wanted to show Imitation of Life at the opening sequence at this point because it was a key example of how I learned to teach film. So it actually represents my move at the end of the 70s out of whatever I was doing before, and also making movies, which I did a couple more. But by that time, film studies were opening up bit by bit, and there was an opening for me at Bulmersh College in Reading, and that was my first teaching job. And that was an extraordinary experience for me because it had a very, very rigorous teaching protocol, which was around textual analysis. And so we watched films the only way you could watch films and analyze them in those days was on editing tables. And so I learnt about how to teach film through my colleagues there, and also learnt about the practice of textual analysis. And I just wanted to say one thing about that, because it seemed to me retrospectively that it was a critical operation of both violence and liberation. It's violence because it does violence to the body of the film. It stops it, it turns it backwards, it shows it in every way except the way that it should be seen in the movie theater. But at the same time, it's a liberation because you find things that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And the opening sequence of Imitation of Life means a lot to me. Partly I could talk about Douglas Sirk, and again refer to Linda and the wonderful season retrospective in Edinburgh, also in 1972. But it's more to think about the way in which the sequence is structured around a balance between two opposing kinds of femininity, two images of motherhood, actually. We have Lana Turner as the mother in distress who's just lost her daughter, and we have Laura, Lana Turner, and we have Annie Juanita Moore, who finds the child and looks after her. Now, what's interesting here is how Douglas Sirk sets up the mise en scène so that Laura, who's going to become a star of theatre and screen later in the movie, is shown as spectacle.
Already being photographed.
Whereas Annie is giving food to the children in a space that's more approximate as possible under the boardwalk at Coney Island to an interior space, a domestic space. And at the same time, the above and the beneath reflects values of class and race. So these were things that the movie sets up, but that as you watch the movie as it flows forward, you couldn't necessarily take in.
Mm-hmm. Let's see the clip, and then we'll talk a bit more about it.
Yeah. I hope you saw what I meant about the mise en scène and the way in which the spaces were put in a kind of rhyming relation to each other. But it was only later, when I stopped the sequence much more, that I realized there was another whole dimension to it, which we can't really illustrate now, but I'd just like to mention, which is that you think that Annie is the only African-American character on the screen, but I noticed that as Lana Turner walks across the front screen to the left, the photographer is raising his camera and is photographing a very elegant African-American extra coming down at the very last split second of the shot at that moment. And also, as Annie walks up the steps, African-American extras are there in the crowd, which brings up questions of how you make visible the invisible. They're apparently invisible, but they are there.
But very deliberately unremarked upon. So, yeah, and they're to be found by later readings. And of course, what's beginning to happen also at this time is this attention within feminist film studies to melodrama.
Yes.
And I think you wanted to say something about melodrama before we go on to see the clip of crystal gazing.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, melodrama, popular Hollywood genre, generally dismissed as women's repeats, with special directors like Douglas Sirk, were stories of women, stories of emotion, family dramas, interiors both of domestic space and interiors of the mind and emotion, and a falling apart of the of family life, ordinary relations under the stresses and strains of exterior pressures.
I mean, it's interesting to me that there is this turn toward melodrama because, of course, what's going on in the 80s are also at the same time, outside the domestic sphere, all these political upheavals. Yes. And I think you're gesturing to those with the sequence from Crystal Gazing that we're going to look at.
Yes.
That's very much marked by that moment in the UK and with the conversation that takes place.
I'd never thought of that.
I'm sorry.
Before,
sorry.
I think
this is what one does when on stage trying to make this thing move through the eras.
But that's a really interesting thought. I mean, I suppose throughout there was a reevaluation of emotion in various ways. But in the Crystal Gazing clip, which we're going to see, we have a rather different perspective on the kind of political, what you might call the utopian political discourse of the 1970s, where we were critiquing language and the way that oppression and exploitation were not simply to be understood economically, but also to be understood through language. And here we might have a kind of subliminal reference to Lacan, but we can slide over that. But in the dialogue that we're going to see, which Peter wrote, he is, to a certain extent, as it were, commenting on what our political principles had been in the 1970s, and also kind of laying them open for critique.
Right.
And I just have to say that there are two characters who are in dialogue here. One of them has just written his PhD on the fairy tale Puss in Boots, and Peter was very interested in Puss in Boots, so it was a project very near to his heart. So his thoughts are there, and he's just had a very apparently disastrous PhD. Viva. Very
Yes.
disastrous PhD,
Yes.
Viva. Yeah.
So this is a bit of insider baseball, you might say, as they say in the United States.
What do they say?
Inside baseball. Yeah.
Right, yes.
We'll see.
It's going to be very inside baseball, and I won't bother to go into all the ins and outs of it.
Yeah. But
It's those of you who are alive at the time will recognize it. Those of you who weren't, I'm afraid, might miss a few points.
It's a jaundiced look at a utopian moment.
Yeah.
Clip, please.
Very well said.
So this is coming up to the 90s.
Yes.
And I think you wanted to talk about this new major shift in spectatorship for you, having to do with technology. Do you want to start there, or do you want to start coming out of this clip and talk about the crisis in history, which was the other theme?
I said earlier that I tended to take up chances that came my way.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a moment in which history was obviously changing and in crisis. It was the moment when the monuments were going down in the old Soviet Union. And my friend Mark Lewis, who must be here somewhere, has he been to wave?
There he is, back there.
There. My friend Mark Lewis, who was living and working as an artist in Canada, working with an organization called Public, which was about bringing public art and bringing art into public spaces. He was really interested in the phenomenon of the bringing down of the statues. And he was in London for a few days and told me about it. And I said, kind of rather out of the blue, that sounds like a nice little documentary project. And so, as in those days there was still some money coming out of state support in Canada, we decided to go ahead and do it. And so Mark and I and a really wonderful team went to Moscow in 1981 and made a film which its message was really that that progressive politics should try and preserve the past, even if that representation of the past wasn't necessarily acceptable to the new moment, but that sweeping away the past was generally a repression which would then return in some unexpected or unpleasant way or another. And so we saw the taking down of the monuments, as it were, as exemplary, not just of what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time, but actually about the whole problem of the representation of history and the representation that a society makes of its history to itself when it's going through a particular upheaval. Or something like
and which,
that.
of course, has gotten replayed in recent years in the United States in awful ways, with the taking down and now pending reinstatement of Confederate monuments.
Yes.
So, but that's another story.
Yes.
Shall we go ahead and take a look at disgraced monuments, and then we have a few more things to still cover?
Yes.
Should we do that? Okay. Clip, please.
I should have said that the montage is actually about the earlier moment when the new revolution, the new Leninist iconography, the cult of Lenin, was specifically replacing the Christian iconography that had gone before it. And so we then move on to the next phase when the iconography of Lenin then disappears in its turn.
In favor of Stalin. Yeah, yeah. No, it's funny because I've just been writing about the work of the Georgian filmmaker Lana Gogoboridze, who just made an autobiographical film at the age of 93, talking a lot about her own mother, who was sent to the Gulag by Stalin for 12 years and survived, and who was one of the first Soviet-era women filmmakers.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah. So just thinking about the ways in which these histories get done and undone,
Yes.
and seem to be irreversible and then crumble. So it's quite interesting. Okay, so coming into the 90s and the arrival of DVD and the ways in which time could be frozen, and what you wanted to say something about, I think, is the kind of new kind of spectatorship that opened itself up for you, and how that influenced your thinking at that time.
Yes. Perhaps I could put it like this, that there were two moments in my life when I felt my spectatorship transformed in front of my own eyes. Not really something that I'd meant to happen, but happened. The first was the one that we've already mentioned, which was when I started seeing movies very differently under the influence of the women's movement in around the early 70s. And this, I just started looking differently. This was a collective experience. It was something that was shared by other women, other feminists, widely discussed, theorized not only by me, but in general. The 1990s experience was very different. It was isolated, individual. It was me on my own with my DVD player and my remote control, exploring the fact that this little remote device gave the spectator control over the flow of a narrative, which then could fragment it, control over the image of the stars, which could then freeze them and hold them for, so that the active male protagonist could be exhibited as spectacle as much as the female star had. So there was, in a sense, a kind of gender sliding there. But also, I found that as I stopped the film, bit by bit, I found that I was thinking more and more about the presence of time and temporality in the cinema. And that cinema, I still think to this day, I might be wrong, anyone can contradict me, that I think that the cinema is more about temporality and about the depiction of time than any of the other arts. Time is actually inscribed into film, not only by the original process of filming itself, but also if we think back to celluloid, for instance. Now, Ruby told me when we were preparing this, she said, Laura, remember, this isn't a lecture. This is a conversation. So you've got to keep me under control. But if you think about celluloid, you think about the relationship between the frame and the sequence. You have instantaneity and duration simultaneously. And nothing else, I think, apart from film achieves this.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because I think the other example of what you're saying and what you wanted to show was Dziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera.
Yes.
So perhaps we should just jump into that and then pick up the rest of these points.
And this was a sequence that had a film made in 1929, once again in the Soviet Union. Isn't it strange? We've got two clips together. But it had its biggest impact on me in the 1990s and when I was working on my book, Death 24 Times a Second, Stillness and Movement in the Stillness.
I'm not going to help you.
Can't remember.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah. Anyway, you'll all see
Let's see the
point.
clip. Yeah, so I think it's also interestingly, inscribing on the screen the role of women editors that were so important in those years. Who was Vertov's wife, who's the editor, and his brother, who's the cinematographer that we see at the beginning.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there are lots of aspects that sequence that I found just very precisely put together about what you could perhaps call the magic of cinema. The actual man with the movie camera, who's the hero, who's doing the filming and who's turning everyday life into the inscription of the everyday and preserving it on the light-sensitive celluloid strip. So that is, in a sense, one aspect of the magic, that moment of preservation, moment of inscription that's then preserved from then till now.
And that shock that happens when the horse suddenly stops
Yes.
and is frozen.
Yes.
And it's the power of cinema, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To animate the inanimate. So with the editing sequence, you then see the other magic of cinema, which is to turn the inanimate strip into the fascinatingly animated film on the screen. And the little clips that you see are taken from moments. Some of them are moments of the faces of women that you've already just seen, but the children come from a sequence where they're watching an actual magician. And so the reference, I think, is very specific to the magic of cinema. And so I started just associating the animation of the inanimate, which is the mechanism of cinema, but also the way in which the cinema keeps the dead alive. And so that by now, everyone we see mostly on screen are no longer with us. And this is also another part of the fascination of film, the way that it actually embalms time and embalms the past. So so in Death 24 Times a Second, I thought about the spectator who becomes fascinated with watching time pass, and all those things that I've just been talking about, who I called the pensive spectator. And then I thought, this does sound all a bit austere. And so I then brought in the possessive spectator, who was fascinated by the image of the star and wanted to be able to hold on to that image and think in cross-gendered ways, upside-down ways, about the importance of the beauty of the human form in industrial film forever and ever.
And amass huge DVD collections to illustrate this, because I think this is also the move to VCRs and video cassettes and DVDs. When you talk about the possessive spectator, it's not only of the image on the screen,
yes,
but the sense in which this becomes a sort of somewhere between a jewel and a commodity that people begin to amass.
Yes, it's between a library and a jewel, in a way. And you can actually begin to own movies for the first time ever, so that the fandom, which used to revolve around posters and pin-ups and so on, could turn into actually owning the real thing, the whole thing.
Yeah. This is our Criterion Classics moment of the talk, But we have something else we want to talk about, which was, it's out of historical sequence, but very much still important and current, which is Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust. And I think that you wanted to talk a bit about the way in which race was and wasn't part of some of these earlier conversations, and the ways in which this film has so much to say about the spectral child and about history and about hauntings.
Yes. Actually, there are 2 points here. Because again, thinking about about my visual pleasure narrative cinema essay, thinking about what finally evolved into my last book, After Images. It has an appendix called Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema, 10 Frequently Asked Questions, 10 FAQs. And one of them were questions lots of people had asked me, why didn't you mention the female spectator? Where is the female spectator in your argument? Where is the gay spectator? Where, and then particularly, why didn't you mention race? And that became quite an important historical issue for me, because I began to realize more and more that one's polemic comes out of one's own politics. You can't necessarily do other people's politics, for one thing. You can't cover every single position, but also that the importance of race in Hollywood film was absence. And I started to think about Hollywood in terms of erasure and apartheid, in fact. The erasure was so extreme, and the presence of African American figures on the screen was so diminished that it was almost like a kind of signature guarantee of the apartheid nature of this cinema. And Imitation of Life, just to give credit to Douglas Sirk, is in a sense a film about that kind of invisibility and erasure. Mm-hmm. And it also fitted in with my interest at the time with the transition in Hollywood in particular from silent, non-synchronized cinema to synchronized cinema. And the way it coincided with, during the 20s, kind of mid-20s, late 20s, a terrific explosion of African-American culture on the stage in Broadway, on the radio, in performance, music. It was really huge. Why, the question was, when Hollywood, well, as one of the Warner Brothers put it, if it can speak, then it can sing. Why wasn't this extraordinary talent taken up and used on the screen when this transition to synchronized sound happened? And there were a couple of attempts, but they weren't serious attempts. And in a way, their failure, again, kind of guaranteed the impossibility of putting African-American presence and African-American culture onto the screen as something celebrated in its own right.
And interestingly, even though we're going to see a clip from Daughters of the Dust, before she made that, Julie Dash made a film about exactly that called Illusions, which was a made in black and white short film about the hiding of black talent, I suppose you could say, that involves a black singer being brought in to dub the voice for the white actress on screen who can't sing. And so it's about the contribution, simultaneous contribution and invisibility.
It's invisibility
of black men and women within the Hollywood system.
Yeah.
But then she goes on finally to be able to make her feature film, her one feature film, Daughters of the Dust, which we're going to look at. Do you want to say anything?
1991.
Yes. But we're kind of moving recklessly through eras here, putting clips here and there to fit the conversation. But I remember distinctly seeing the premiere of Daughters of the Dust at a private screening in New York that was attended by Bell Hooks, Tony Cade Bambara, many other really important, now gone figures of that moment as they came to look at it and talk about it. Should we see, do you want to say anything about the two sequences put together that we're about to
Yes,
look at?
I mean, again, to put it in context, I wrote about Daughters of the Dust in a series of 5 studies of films made by women and about crises of motherhood. I mean, in fact, the crisis is less acute in Daughters of the Dust. But in the other films that I wrote about alongside this, it's about crises of motherhood. It's also about thinking about the way in which, I think we might watch it.
Good, better.
Yeah. And again, the clips that Ruby and I chose are ones that emphasize Julie Dash's reflections on cinema as a magical form. And again, very, very importantly, on the way in which past and present address each other.
Yeah, and the ways in which we're haunted by the past, in fact. But we'll wait.
Yes,
We'll wait on that.
yes,
Okay.
yes. I think we saw something of the beauty of the sequence of the men walking across the sands with the fades in between them. But the whole film is magically shot itself, but it also references the magic of cinema. And very importantly, brings together the past and the future. It takes place over one single day when the Pesant family are coming together to have a feast before most of them move north. It's set in 1901, I think.
And move on to the mainland, move off
and
the
they're
island.
going to move to the cities.
Yep.
Ruby, they're going
Yep.
to move to Chicago and
Right.
New York,
Right.
which is why the unborn child looking through the stereoscope sees the streets
Beautiful.
of where they're going to go.
Yeah.
And it's also set on the island of the...
Right.
So it's got a very extraordinary contained time and space. Which is also, just to go back to our earlier conversation, relates perhaps in a rather different way to melodrama and the story of the mother, but in this case, not directed by a male director, but directed by Julie Dash, and with the central figure of the great, I couldn't work out how many greats she was. I think she's a great, great, great grandmother by this time, with her memory, which she keeps in her box.
Right. Well, it's so much about cultural transmission, and it's about loss as well as persistence and traces of survival, traces of the past. And and it was very powerful when it was made. When that came out, there was nothing else like it.
Well, I'm not sure that there is still.
Well, I remember that, before the phenomenon of Black Panther, that had people dressing up and going to the theater in groups. Before that, this was shown at Film Forum, a tiny theater in Lower Manhattan.
And was shown
in
Film Forum.
Okay, excellent taste, obviously. And the buses, people were chartering buses from other cities to go to Film Forum to see it. It had to be held over. So it's not just our appreciation now, but the way in which Black communities responded to that film and came to see it was very exceptional.
Yes. But then Julie Dash didn't get another feature film.
No, never got to make another
this
feature.
is going back perhaps to some of the points that Jay made at the beginning, the struggle that women have had when we celebrated them in the festivals of the 1970s. Still the struggle went on, and she worked in television, I think.
A bit.
A bit.
She has.
Do you know what?
But yes, I do. However, we're closing in on the end of this evening.
Oh, yes.
And so I want to pull us out of this moment,
Yeah.
back into a little bit of the present as we finish with something unexpected from the past. And think about now, this has been such an extraordinary evening of going through your perceptions of cinema, your histories with cinema, the histories of your writing. And to end with this, which I think is such an extraordinary, almost one-off of a film that kind of stood on its own for many years until a new kind of black cinema evolved.
Yes.
And
But I think it's also, if I can interrupt, Ruby, because you said, what would I say to wind up?
yes,
And what I was thinking about in terms of the Julie Dash film, Daughters of the Dust, but also the Iranian film Under the Skin of the City, made by Rakshan Beni Etemad, Jean Dielman, dear to this cinema. And then there were the two films I wrote about, which are made from compilation material, Un'ora sola ti vorrei and The Arbor.
which is so extraordinary.
So extraordinary. All crises of motherhood, but also telling the kinds of stories that I think male directors wouldn't have thought of approaching. And what's so important about women's cinema is that they tell these stories and they tell them with different kinds of approaches to narrativity. And I know Joanna is here.
Joanna Hogg.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we could use her films also as another example. But what's important for our culture and our society is that these stories come into existence, and they're not there just for the benefit of women. They're actually there for the benefit of the whole people, the whole of society, because the lack of presence of women making art, making culture, telling stories is actually been a tragic loss to society as a whole. Well, I introduced the last.
You want to have the cat? We'll introduce. Well,
the cat.
we're going to end with one final tiny, tiny film that is not about a man or a woman.
It does have a star in it. I've called it my favorite film. It's only 40 seconds long. And it's a Lumière film made in 1896 or 7. And Ruby was teasing me about it, but we still thought we'd show it. And I love it for its cinematic qualities. It has an action star, and it also plays in a very cinematic way with different planes, with the foreground plane and a background plane in which you can see, again, something has always appealed to film spectators as magical, the movement of the leaves in the wind and the movement of steam coming out of a chimney.
And the central figure, of course.
And then
I thought it was good to end with it because it's a very rare example of Laura Mulvey being in sync with pop culture of Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok.
Which isn't true at all, I'm not.
You can judge for yourself. Go ahead. Clip, please.
Thank you, Ruby. So much, everybody, for not only coming along, but being such a wonderful and responsive audience. I hope that was okay.